the Board of Inquiry to test that.
Secondly, Mr Chair, I understand that the Twyford users did come to Council in late January, early February, and the staff decided to have a meeting with them to which councillors weren't included. In future, do you think perhaps it might be a good idea to include councillors at that stage so that we're all up to the play together and can perhaps react faster?
We were approached, and at that point our understanding was that it was an operational meeting. It was how do we get our way through the system, and there was no need at that point to have councillors at the meeting. From my perspective, I'm quite comfortable and open to that proposition in future. If that's necessary and required, well, we would do that. Mr Chair, perhaps could I just make a couple of other points to this before I have too many more questions, because there are a couple of things I just wanted to note.
Just before we do that, I'd like to draw this to a close, or do you think we should break for lunch and come back? I mean, there's people here that have been waiting for this for quite some time, so I'd like to think we could get through it without being here all day, though. Okay.
So a couple of other points I'd like to make. First of all, in terms of developing this paper, I'd like to acknowledge the positive and proactive contribution of the Twyford Irrigator Group around this. They've certainly, the engagement and dialogue with them has been really valuable in terms of clarifying the thinking and getting that stuff captured and putting it to you. A couple of other just points of clarification. One is that point 40 on page 119, the final sentence should actually read, "This was not specifically provided for by the consent." So we did actually step outside of the realms. Point 75 on page 112, clarification that what we're 122, sorry. What we're proposing there is engagement with the Twyford irrigators to understand what the issues are, how big the problem is, and then what the solutions might be. So rather than trying to deal with it necessarily through a global consent process, let's first of all understand how big the issue is and then look at a range of options for dealing with those. And then point 78 on page 123, just reinforcing that really that issue or that matter is about recognising that when the minimum flows and allocations were set in the consent renewal process, it ended up in a situation where the people on B or X permits effectively have a take that they can't exercise. Well, they could exercise, but it's not practicable to do that because the river's high, soils are wet, so they don't need to irrigate. And then by the time it gets below, obviously they can't. So part of that is to look at those flows, because they are in a system that's challenging to set flows in technically, and to look at the allocation blocks and their separation and say, have we got it right? And yeah, that was it.
Chairman, at the moment the recommendation is the report be received, and my feeling and others I've been talking to is that we should actually say some of the things that Mr Maxwell's been suggesting in the go forward as opposed to the historical. And so this is his suggestions, which I think could become as noted resolutions. The second part of the resolution. Correct.
Any further questions, Councillor?
Yes, just final, well, from me anyway. The Twyford Irrigators Group and the GAG Group, what commonality is there between the two?
I don't know.
Does the Twyford Irrigators Group formally represent all of the consent holders in that area?
The Twyford Irrigator Group probably certainly does represent the people within those three consented areas that I described earlier. Probably the people in the unconfined and the semi-confined are the people most interested in this and most engaged in it, I would guess, because they're the people who are impacted by minimum flows. I guess I'd say that they are probably very well connected and operating very well with the irrigator community because of the successful outcome that we got out of the Rauperi this summer. So there is enough of a network there, and it's working well enough to have had some quite positive outcome out of a pretty tough situation.
And around the soft stop option, so paragraph 55 and in particular paragraph 59, perhaps you can clarify the Narrow Irrigation Society, that is the up above Fernhill Irrigation Group, isn't it?
Correct.
And they actually ran a soft stop option, voluntary stage reductions, and I read that over this particular summer. Have I got the years right?
Yes, that's
and
correct.
So they did actually manage to keep that flow above the ban.
Only for a few days, but they certainly, looking at the hydrograph, it looked as though they had some benefit, but certainly not as significant a benefit as they achieved out of the Rauperi.
Well, different source of water. Because
it's a completely different, hydrologically different.
But the Twyford one that are tied to the Narrow actually would have benefited from that by a few days as well.
Potentially, yes, they would have.
Was someone happy to take us to the motion here, Councillor?
Happy to move.
Happy to move. And what are you actually moving?
Are you looking? I was just receiving the report, but are you looking at additions?
Mr. Chair, could I ask the mover, please, if he would consider adding one more point to that, number 8, please, which is look at sustainable augmentation of Rauperi and also ideas such as pump testing to enhance solutions.
Is that being done though?
Certainly, it's an omission not to have put in there that we want to look at making that Rauperi augmentation a more permanent option. In terms of the pump tests, we've looked at that option. Pump tests are available typically this time of the year for looking at localised effects. The hydrogeology team said that it's not something that they want to run with to try and develop the model. So it's not something we would be looking for model development. Consent holders already have the ability to run pump tests and consent conditions anyway. So there would be limited benefit, or if any at all, of including that as an action. I think the action is really about the items ahead of that. That's where the solutions will lie, in my view.
So would you mind just spelling out, this is probably my last acronym plea, TIG.
Sorry, that's
I'm so pleased to see I've had such an impact on this council with regarding acronyms.
Well, Mr. Chair, clearly this whole issue is becoming extremely vexed and problematic, particularly for growers, horticultural growers who have had their livelihoods majorly impacted. I think in every event, no matter the best intent and process, there are things to learn, and clearly the staff have taken on board the opportunities to look at processes, etc. I was particularly interested myself to see whether our predictive ability could be improved and we could respond much more rapidly than potentially we may have. Having said that, that has significant limitations. Again, commenting on, if you like, short-term responses, we possibly could be taking an approach similar to the way we look at flood detection and management in terms of drought as well. So our responsiveness could be improved in that regard. However, we can't get away from the fact that permanent water storage is the answer that everyone needs to have clearly in front of us. And if you think about the impacts that a dam project, no matter whether it be in the Ruataniwha, if there had been one in place this year, think of the impacts that would have had on, for example, the lamb crop. People focus particularly on the issue of dairying, but with 30-odd% increase in pastoral land available for red meat production, we have this huge opportunity to immunise ourselves against climate change and against drought simply by producing a positive result from Ruataniwha on its own. That would result in excess of 200,000 to 300,000 lambs being able to be taken through to slaughter from Hawke's Bay alone. And reading and talking and listening to the red meat industry recently, that opportunity potentially has the potential to rescue the red meat industry, that sort of development. So getting back to the current other catchments affected, there has, and we should take a long-term view. We should be looking at urgent planning around further water storage in these catchments, and really get involved in that. That would be my plea for an incoming council going forward, is that move rapidly to water storage in those catchments as well. I can't say whether council was appropriately briefed at all times. I'm just a little concerned from a councillor perspective that we may not have had, or at least we may have been guilty at some points of being a little bit sleepy in our response. And if that's the case, then myself as a councillor, I apologise to growers that were impacted if it was possible to rescue their situation as a result of that. It appears also that staff were working very, very actively at a range of solutions, and good on them. My comment would be perhaps you took on and have taken a bit of a hammering politically when you shouldn't have. That should have been the preserve of councillors to have borne that particular responsibility. So if there's a lesson in that, it's to pass that buck on to the people that it belongs to. So with those comments, Mr Chair, happy to move the recommendation plus those notes which portend future action by council and staff.
You, Councillor Gill. Douglas.
Mr Chairman, in support of that, I'd make a couple of points and then maybe take some points on the 1 to 7. Firstly, water security is really what this is about.
1 to 8, Mr.
Yes, 1 to 8.
1 to 8. 1 to 8, sorry, 1 to 8. Yeah, apologise, I didn't write it down. And then I'll let you talk about number 8. How's that? Water security is what it's about, and indeed it's what makes Hawke's Bay tick in its fundamental part of the industry, and we all know that. But the second point I'd make is that drought is not an operational matter. I think it's unusual, and I think we've learnt that, and Councillor Curtin's referred to it, and I actually think if ever this comes up, and it's very likely to be, the elected side is engaged in the solutions as much as in the conversation. What I still find strange about reading this report, and I think it is a good report and it's been well presented, is the gap between what the staff were certainly doing and still a perception and a commentary out there that the Regional Council was asleep at the wheel to some extent. I still haven't heard an answer, and I don't expect to hear it necessarily around here, but I think that's got to be a debate out over the next couple of days now this report exists. I wasn't here on the council at that stage, so it's easy for me to duck it in that sense. But sure as hell out there at the moment, it is a big commentary, rightly or wrongly, and I think in terms of the report, wrongly, that the Regional Council wasn't allowing, for example, takes to be taken from bores across to people that were taking them closer to the stream, effectively surface takes. And I find that disconcerting to see this debate, because I think information perhaps has not been conveyed either from the council or certainly from some growers back to council. But the go-forward one is the 1 to 8, and the first one there about the tank process, and I've been involved in tank only in the 2 meetings, or 1.5 really, and I'm pretty impressed with that process, and it's been going, I think it started before the drought. But in there, water storage is part of the commentary and part of the discussion, which it has to be as well. The second one is about the new water. This is the deep wells or deeper wells. I find it curious that a deep well is only 100 metres, but however, if that works, that's certainly something we've got to start looking at, because that is where the water storage, in a sense, is. It's a dirty great big Ruatanifer, if you like, sitting under the Heratonga, perhaps. And then the rest of the conversations are about dealing with the mechanics of soft options and soft starts and soft stops. Number 6 about, and it's on the board as well, about what it is the water requirement for a plant, for a mature tree, presumably, as opposed to a young tree, and there's quite a difference. And so that's a priority matter that irrigators have got to deal to as much as some science behind it. Because talking with Plant of Food, as I do on other matters, it's actually relatively hard to kill a tree. That's been going for a while, but it certainly is quite easy to kill a young one, and that's part of the issue here, I suspect. And the number 7 in terms of the errors, and we've already had the ex-consents mentioned. I don't know if that's considered one of the errors, but certainly sounds like a useless consent. But there's also frost protection and filling your tanks for spraying, which have been tangled up in the consents to some extent and need to be untangled, because I think they become an irritant, and this will give us a chance to actually address those, either by some variation or ultimately by changing the consents. And I'll let, in my comments, let Councillor Rimersol deal with number 8, because I didn't write it down, so I apologise for that. But I think this is a go-forward position which could be really helpful. The last point is, and Councillor Curtin's mentioned he won't be here, and some of us probably won't be here as well. It's urgent, and that's the other point we have to take out of this.